There's a bear on the prowl in the Ukraine, and it's the Russian bear. I was curious about this notion of the bear symbolizing Russia, and apparently that goes back to the 16th century. It's something that predates communism. It continued that symbol during communism, and in fact it represents also the Russian Federation now. Now you know that things are heating up, not just because the Russians have sent close to 100,000 troops toward the Ukraine border. They have done some, I've actually seen some video of Russian military jets landing at airfields at the Ukraine border. And perhaps the most troubling, here's the New York Post, U.S. embassy families to evacuate Ukraine as Russia tensions rise. You know, they say that when there's a storm coming, like the rats all go underground because they sort of know it's coming. Well, you can tell when the embassy is being cleared out. I mean, how familiar is this? And to me, it raises larger problems here. This is, yes, it's about the Ukraine, but it's also about China and Taiwan. It's also about the fact that when Democrats come to power, the world always seems to become a more dangerous place. I mean, think back, Jimmy Carter, the fall of Iran. Think of Bill Clinton and the emboldening of bin Laden and the plotting of 9/11, not to mention the Arab Spring, which of course came later, but was, in a sense, motivated by the lassitude of the Clinton years, and then under Obama, all kinds of chaos in all kinds of places, and now, of course, Biden. Now, there are two schools of thought in thinking about the Ukraine, and neither of them seems to me to be satisfactory. The first one is, well, let's call it the warmongering approach. Here's Michael McFaul, a former U.S. ambassador to Russia. He says, in the global struggle between democracy and dictatorship, and the fight for a peaceful Europe, Ukraine is on the front line, not unlike West Germany during the Cold War. Well, number one, this is a facile transplantation from one crisis to another. Second, there's a huge difference between Ukraine and West Germany. To take a single example, Ukraine used to be part of Russia. In fact, in my series talking about Russian literature, a number of the Russian writers, and I'll talk later today about Gogol. Gogol was born in the Ukraine, and the Ukraine was then part of the Tsarist Empire. So part of what makes this a little tricky is that in the case of Ukraine, Russia is saying not that we are invading a bordering or neighboring country, but rather we are exercising influence and seeking to sort of absorb a country that was always, or at least that was historically part of Russia. By the way, China makes exactly the same claim about Taiwan. It's what China is saying is we're not invading India, we're not invading Europe, we're essentially absorbing a country, Taiwan, that was part of China. Look at the people over there, they are Chinese. So we have to understand the point of view of the people that we're up against. Now, on the other side, there's the warmongering side that I mentioned. On the other side, you've got the, I would call it quasi-isolationist side. It's not our fight. We have nothing to do with this. Here's Matt Walsh, kind of a typical expression of this view. Ukraine is not our country and not our problem. Anyone who would risk a war with Russia for the sake of some random country 6,000 miles away is a fool or a psychopath, or both. Now, strictly speaking, this is true. I don't see, it's difficult to think of the United States going to war over the Ukraine, but it's also difficult to consider the United States going to war over Taiwan. And then would the United States go to war if China took over South Korea? How about if China then took over Japan? Would the United States go to war over that? So when you apply this kind of America First principle at an extreme, it would seem to suggest that the United States should basically mind its own business, let all the bullies of the world satisfy their appetite for aggression. We are hands off. What's this got to do with us until you show up? Basically, at New York City or in California, this is not our problem. I really cannot agree with this. I think it actually reflects a naive and perhaps even foolish view of power politics. Why? Because the simple truth is that there are innumerable options in between doing nothing and going to war. But number two, the whole concept of deterrence is that you don't want to get to the bad place where you're forced to think about those options and exercise them. I mean, here's China. This is Fox News. China flying dozens of warplanes near Taiwan. Now ask yourself, why is all this happening now? Why is China suddenly sort of taunting Taiwan? Why is Russia moving troops to the Ukraine? Well, I think the answer is not merely Biden, but the humiliation of America and Afghanistan. Essentially, the combination of the ignominious retreat from Afghanistan, a Saigon-style withdrawal, the leaving of Americans behind, and then perhaps all this kind of epicene and effeminate displays of the woke military. People sort of cadets walking around in high heels, people essentially doing all kinds of trans dances and salutes and this sort of worship of identity politics. Any other country looking at this would say this is not a serious power. This is basically a joke, and we don't have anything to fear from these guys. And this is the point. It was Teddy Roosevelt who said, speak softly but carry a big stick. And if you think what Teddy was saying, it's not intervene everywhere, and neither was Reagan. With Reagan, it was peace through strength. Be judicious in the use of force, but be willing to use force where necessary. Use it in a proportional way to achieve your objectives. Think of how successfully the United States, for example, deployed force to push the Soviets out of Afghanistan without getting into a U.S.-Soviet war. So the Ukraine, I think, is becoming a problem, and it's symbolic of the larger problem. And the larger problem is that the United States seems to be voluntarily ceding or relinquishing its position as the world's superpower. And for this, I blame largely Biden and the Democrats.